I have been a fan of Alan Watts for about a decade now. The first time I heard of Alan Watts was when I picked up his book, The Way of Zen, at a bookstore. It explained philosophy and religion in such an approachable way that I was immediately hooked. This book opened my mind to the idea that a religion can admit that they don't have an answer for everything, that unknowability will always be a part of the universe. And the idea that the self isn't ultimately real was just what I needed to hear in my early 20s. Alan Watts' description of considering yourself a genuine fake was the perfect antidote to imposter syndrome. I went on to read most of his books and listen to many of his lectures, as many as I could get my hands on. Alan Watts didn't pretend to be the ultimate scholar or an academic on any subject. He tried to avoid labels, especially the dreaded label of guru. So he called himself a spiritual entertainer. My favorite description he gave himself was unrutted philosopher, because he always left room for the possibility of changing his mind on things. His books and lectures and radio shows introduced Buddhism to a lot of Americans in the 1960s. Nowadays, it seems like most people get introduced to him from Alan Watts' Chill Step YouTube videos. I think the most accurate modern description of him would be Eastern philosophy influencer. If he was alive today, he'd definitely be a drunk Twitch streamer. One key idea I took away from his books was that you can be an atheist, but still be trapped in religious thinking about the universe. Watts called the model of the universe that monotheistic religions used the ceramic model. This imagines the universe as a pot made out of clay, created by the all-powerful creator God. When atheists stop believing in a creator God, they often turn to what Watts called the fully automatic model. The world was still understood as an artifact, but on the model of an automatic machine. The laws of nature were still there, but no lawmaker. According to the deists, the Lord had made this machine and set it going, but then went to sleep or off on a vacation. But according to the atheists, naturalists, and agnostics, the world was fully automatic. Watts joked that since the ceramic model is wrong, it should be called the crackpot myth, and atheists who see the world as an artifact retained the crackpot myth just without the potter. Atheists got rid of the assumption of God, but kept other assumptions from the model. Watts' book, The Book on the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are, which is an incredibly pretentious title in my opinion, talks about how it is taboo in many cultures to talk about the world in any other terms besides the crackpot myth. In this book, he instead suggests a different model for the universe that is similar to ancient Hindu myths, while also agreeing with modern science. I will add another taboo to the argument, but first, I will present his position using quotes from the book. The most strongly enforced of all known taboos is the taboo against knowing who or what you really are behind the mask of your apparently separate, independent, and isolated ego. Briefly, the thesis is that the prevalent sensation of oneself as a separate ego enclosed in a bag of skin is a hallucination, which accords neither with Western science nor with the experimental philosophy religions of the East, in particular the central and germinal Vedanta philosophy of Hinduism. We suffer from a hallucination, from a false and distorted sensation of our own existence as living organisms. Most of us have the sensation that I myself is a separate center of feeling and action, living inside and bounded by the physical body. A center which confronts an external world of people and things, making contact through the senses with a universe both alien and strange. The illusion that organisms move entirely on their own is immensely persuasive until we settle down, as scientists do, to describe their behavior carefully. Then the scientist, be they biologist, sociologist, or physicist, finds very rapidly that they cannot say what the organism is doing unless, at the same time, they describe the behavior of its surroundings. The more detailed the description of an ant's behavior becomes, the more it has to include such matters as density, humidity, and temperature of the surrounding atmosphere, the types and sources of its food, the social structure of its own species, and that of neighboring species with which it has some symbiotic or preying relationship. When at last the whole vast list is compiled, they may well have the impression that the ant's behavior is no more than its automatic and involuntary reaction to its environment. What does it mean, they ask themselves, that a description of what the ant is doing must include what its environment is doing? It means that the thing or entity they are studying and describing has changed. It started out to be the individual ant, but very quickly became the whole field of activities in which the ant is found. To sum up, just as no thing or organism exists on its own, it does not act on its own. Furthermore, every organism is a process. Thus, the organism is not other than its actions. The organism, including its behavior, is a process which is to be understood only in relation to the larger and longer process of its environment. For what we mean by understanding or comprehension is seeing how parts fit into a whole, and then realizing that they don't compose the whole, as one assembles a jigsaw puzzle, but that the whole is a pattern, a complex wiggliness, which has no separate parts. Parts are a fiction of language, of the calculus of looking at the world through a net, which seems to chop it up into bits. Parts only exist for purposes of figuring and describing, and as we figure out the world, we become confused if we do not remember this all the time. The only real you is the one that comes and goes, manifests and withdraws itself eternally in and as every conscious being. For you is the universe looking at itself from billions of points of view, points that come and go so that the vision is forever new. So that is how Watts explains the taboo from the perspective of science. It gets a bit abstract explaining things this way. Sometimes the best way to explain something is to make it into a story, or a myth. The difficulty in realizing this to be so is that conceptual thinking cannot grasp it. We are forced, therefore, to speak of it through myth, that is, through special metaphors, analogies, and images which say what it is like as distinct from what it is. At one extreme of its meaning, myth is fable, falsehood, or superstition. But at another, myth is a useful and fruitful image by which we make sense of life in somewhat the same way that we can explain electrical forces by comparing them with the behavior of water or air. Yet myth, in the second sense, is not to be taken literally, just as electricity is not meant to be confused with air or water. Thus, in using myth, one must take care not to confuse the image with fact, which would be like climbing up the signpost instead of following the road. Myth, then, is the form in which I try to answer when children ask me those fundamental metaphysical questions which come so readily to their minds. Again and again, I have found that they seem to be satisfied with a simple and very ancient story. This isn't my story at all, for any student of the history of religions will know that it comes from ancient India, and it is the mythical way of explaining the Vedanta philosophy. Vedanta is the teaching of the Upanishads, a collection of dialogues, stories, and poems, some of which go back to at least 800 BC. Though the story is based on the Upanishads, Alan Watts has significantly adapted it, so someone curious about Vedanta should also research more faithful interpretations, or merely view the story as Watts introduced it, a story made to satisfy complex questions for children. Sophisticated Hindus do not think of God as a special and separate super person who rules the world from above like a monarch. Their God is underneath rather than above everything. And he or it plays the world from inside. God also likes to play hide and seek, but because there's nothing outside God, he has no one but himself to play with. But he gets over this difficulty by pretending that he is not himself. This is his way of hiding from himself. He pretends that he is you and I and all the people in the world, all the animals, all the plants, all the rocks, and all the stars. In this way, he has strange and wonderful adventures, some of which are terrible and frightening. But these are just like bad dreams, for when he wakes up, they will disappear. Now when God plays hide and pretends that he is you and I, he does it so well that it takes him a long time to remember where and how he hid himself. But that's the whole fun of it, just what he wanted to do. He doesn't want to find himself too quickly, or that would spoil the game. That is why it is so difficult for you and me to find out that we are God in disguise, pretending not to be himself. But when the game has gone on long enough, all of us will wake up, stop pretending, and remember that we are all one single self, the God who is all there is and who lives forever and ever. Of course, you must remember that God isn't shaped like a person. People have skins, and there's always something outside our skins. If there weren't, we wouldn't know the difference between what is inside and outside our bodies. But God has no skin and no shape, because there isn't any outside to him. With a sufficiently intelligent child, I illustrate this with a Mobius strip, a ring of paper twisted once in such a way that it has only one side and one edge. The inside and the outside of God are the same. And though I have been talking about God as he and not she, God isn't a man or a woman. I didn't say it because we usually say it for things that aren't alive. God is the self of the world, but you can't see God for the same reason that without a mirror, you can't see your own eyes, and you certainly can't bite your own teeth or look inside your head. Yourself is that cleverly hidden because it is God hiding. This story, obviously mythical in form, is not given as a scientific description of the way things are. Based on the analogies of games and the drama, and using the much worn-out word of God for the player, the story claims only to be like the way things are. I use it just as astronomers use the image of inflating a black balloon with spots on it for the galaxies to explain the expanding universe. But to most children, and many adults, the myth is at once intelligible, simple, and fascinating. Watts's myth is a great way to make a narrative out of philosophy. This story explains plainly how you can think of the universe from a new perspective. When I first read this book, I was already an atheist, so I didn't believe the Abrahamic creation myth, but I still subconsciously held on to some assumptions that came from thinking about the world in Abrahamic terms. I didn't believe God took some clay and breathed life into it, but I still thought of myself as an independent source of action that appeared one day in the world. So being introduced to this Hindu myth was a new framework to contrast with and reveal my hidden assumptions. That's how these myths can teach you things even as an atheist, just like how testing a wrong hypothesis can still help you learn. Now, I'd like to make an addition to the myth that aims to reveal another assumption we don't realize we have. Watts's myth was to show the taboo against knowing who you are. I agree with his central claim that the self isn't ultimately a separate object from the environment. But I think there is still a hidden assumption that comes from a different illusion of self. Let me try to explain first in myth form. God plays the world like a game, but God doesn't play games like you and me. God doesn't experience time like us. When we sit down to play a board game, we put all our pieces at the start and try to get to the finish line. But remember that God isn't shaped like a person. And so God doesn't experience time like a person either. They aren't necessarily confined to linear time. They don't need to play the game in chronological order to have fun playing. Just like how two teams can have a decades-long rivalry, even though all the players have changed since the rivalry started. God can join a game at any point and have all the memories of the previous turns in the game as though they have been playing the whole time, like a person experiencing it in linear time. But how does God experience the whole universe? You might think, well, if I was to experience the whole universe, I'd start at the beginning and work my way to the end. But what about when life forms overlap? Do you start with the earlier life form's whole life, and then once that is done, jump back in time to experience the next life form from start to finish? What about when two life forms are born at the same time? Do you flip a coin to decide which life form to experience first? This problem disappears when you realize that God doesn't group experiences from one organism together. Instead, all conscious experiences are unified, not separated out into egos. God doesn't play hide and seek, so at the end of a very disciplined life, they can finally find themselves. God is hiding in every moment and can potentially find themselves in every moment despite not experiencing it in linear time. We are all windows for God to experience themselves, but the way God looks through our windows doesn't closely mimic our perspective. God views the universe from outside linear time, which they had created. God experiences every moment simultaneously as the present, though nonetheless a flux. God doesn't play as one organism at a time. God plays as the entire universe. God doesn't play as one moment in time. God plays as eternity. My addition to the myth is meant to show that even though all conscious experiences are unified, the experiences of a single being aren't unified on their own in an ego. They aren't separate from other beings' experiences. Assuming a single being's experiences are unified is a result of projecting mental concepts onto the universe. It is like picturing God as an old man with a beard. We are just projecting the image of a stereotypical wise person onto our concept of God. In the same way, we project our conception of time onto God too. We assume God experiences every moment of an individual's life in order before experiencing another life. But that's as mistaken as thinking God is shaped like a human. We might have gotten rid of the idea of the man with the white beard sitting in the clouds, but our vision of the world is still shaped by our limited human perspective. The myth that Watts described is the idea that everything in the entire universe is ultimately unified. In this video, I want to introduce the idea that this unity goes further than even Watts suggested. It goes further by claiming people incorrectly feel connected to their own futures more than other people's futures. It is taboo to consider that you ultimately only experience this present moment. But that is the taboo I'd like to break with this video. The taboo Watts wrote about in his book is the taboo against knowing who you are, the taboo of contradicting the crackpot model of the universe. He broke the taboo by describing the Vedanta-inspired model of the universe. But I think there is another assumption that Watts didn't mention, the taboo against knowing who you aren't. So here's the very radical sounding claim. The self is such a strong illusion that it convinces us to anticipate experiencing a future we don't actually experience. The you that starts a journey isn't going to be the you that experiences the end of it. An individual perceives themselves as a unified stream of experience because they have memories of the past, but they are in fact just a chain of separate experiencers with overlapping memories and functions. This is similar to what the philosopher Derek Parfit called the extreme claim, which he described as the idea that ordinary survival is no better than dying and being replaced by a perfect replica with your memories. But I need to mention that Parfit didn't accept the extreme claim. He said that though the extreme claim is defensible, it can also be defensibly denied. So remember that term, the extreme claim. It is a useful term that I'll use as shorthand later. My argument is that there is no separate, continuing experiencer feeling every moment of your life. Merely many moments that all think that if they work hard today, they will personally benefit from the rewards in the future. But in fact, these separate experiences are blind to the intervals in between them. Watts never talked about this taboo, but after rereading his book, it seems like he came remarkably close to it though. The mind, that is to say, our conscious attention, notices only the upbeat. The dark, silent, or off interval is ignored. It is almost a general principle that consciousness ignores intervals, and yet cannot notice any pulse of energy without them. For especially when rates of vibration are slow, as with day and night, or life and death, we are forced to be aware of the black or negative aspect of the world. Imagination cannot grasp simple nothingness, and must therefore fill the void with fantasies. Watts is talking about filling the void of what happens after you die with fantasies, but I think it applies just as well to the idea that we filled the void in between conscious thoughts with the fantasy of the continuing self. We all hold the assumption that you should anticipate experiencing the future, but I don't think that the assumption is correct. I think that the you of today is not going to experience what the you of tomorrow will feel. That is why I call this the taboo against knowing who you aren't, since you aren't going to experience the future. This is quite a big claim. That's why I like referring to it as the extreme claim. But I believe I can follow Watts's example and back it up first with science, and second with concepts from Eastern philosophy. We seldom realize, for example, that our most private thoughts and emotions are not actually our own, for we think in terms of languages and images which we did not invent, but which were given to us by our society. In that quote, Watts is talking about us being given the assumption we are separate from the universe. But we are also given the assumption that ourselves include every moment experienced by our organism. We are given this assumption by evolution. Since the first brain evolved, it has been reinforcing the idea that the body is unified. It greatly benefits our survival to have a mental model of our bodies so we can move them more effectively. Eventually, in humans, it benefited our survival to expand our mental models to include predictions of our future so we can cooperate with others. But ultimately, these models are just concepts and not representative of reality. Why would natural selection design a brain that leaves people deluded about themselves? One answer is that if we believe something about ourselves, that will help us convince other people to believe it. And certainly it is to our benefit, or more precisely, it would have been to the benefit of the genes of our hunter-gatherer ancestors, to convince the world that we are coherent, consistent actors who have things under control. I explain in depth the evolution of the sensation in my other video here. I also have another video that explains the organization of the human brain and why it feels so convincingly like we are in singular control of almost all of our actions, even though we are not. I'd recommend checking those out since I think the scientific argument is a lot more convincing than the philosophical argument. But since I already covered that topic in those videos, this video will focus on philosophy. In my limited research, I haven't found any Buddhist philosophy that goes as far as saying there is no reason to anticipate experiencing the future, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was, because they seem to be very close to that conclusion. At least, it seems that way from Watts' explanation of it in his book, The Way of Zen. It appears that the entire sense of subjective isolation, of being the one who was given a mind and to whom experience happens, is an illusion of bad semantics. The hypnotic suggestion of repeated wrong thinking. For there is no myself apart from the mind-body, which gives structure to my experience. It is likewise ridiculous to talk of this mind-body as something which was passively and involuntarily given a certain structure. It is that structure, and before the structure arose, there was no mind-body. Zen points out that our previous self is just an idea, useful and legitimate enough if seen for what it is, but disastrous if identified with our real nature. When we are no longer identified with the idea of ourselves, the entire relationship between subject and object, knower and known, undergoes a sudden and revolutionary change. Consequently, the whole notion of getting something out of life, of seeking something from experience, becomes absurd. To put it another way, it becomes vividly clear that in concrete fact, I have no other self than the totality of the things of which I am aware. Buddhism has frequently compared the course of time to the apparent motion of a wave, wherein the actual water only moves up and down, creating the illusion of a piece of water moving over the surface. It is a similar illusion that there is a constant self moving through successive experiences, constituting a link between them in such a way that the youth becomes the man, who becomes the graybeard, who becomes the corpse. The part of Buddhism that is closest to the claim I'm making in this video is the concept of Anatman, which translates to non-self. The Anatman doctrine is not quite the bald assertion that there is no real self, Atman, at the basis of our consciousness. The point is rather that there is no self or basic reality which may be grasped, either by direct experience or by concepts. The Buddha's view was that a self so grasped was no longer the true self, but only one more of the innumerable forms of illusion. Thus, Anatman might be expressed in the form, the true self is non-self, since any attempt to conceive the self, believe in the self, or seek for the self immediately thrusts it away. It is fundamental to every school of Buddhism that there is no ego, no enduring entity which is the constant subject of our changing experiences. For the ego exists in an abstract sense alone, being an abstraction from memory, somewhat like the illusory circle of fire made by a whirling torch. Yet it is obvious that we are not confronted with literal nothingness. It is true that when pressed, every attempt to catch hold of our world leaves us empty-handed. Furthermore, when we try to be sure at least of ourselves, the knowing, catching subjects, we disappear. We cannot find any self apart from the mind, and we cannot find any mind apart from those very experiences which the mind, now vanished, was trying to grasp. It was very interesting rereading Watts's books after researching the extreme claim, which, in case you forgot, is the idea that we won't experience the future. Watts never talked directly about it, but Eastern philosophy still helps to see the idea in a new light. Watts takes what otherwise would be a sad perspective, that your sense of self isn't real, and turns it into this freeing realization. I'm very glad I read Watts first because the two taboos complement each other so well. Let's compare the two taboos with a visual representation. Before reading Watts, I imagined a boundary around my body. This was the boundary of my existence. Anything outside of it I didn't consider to be a part of me. But after learning about Eastern philosophy, that boundary expanded and disappeared, so it became easier to feel connected with all of the universe. This is breaking the first taboo. I still recognize my body as a meaningful boundary, but the ultimate boundary of my existence includes everything now. Once that conceptual border is dispelled, it might seem like everything is unified, but there is still another border when you look at it from the dimension of time. Here are my experiences through time represented by circles, from infancy, through childhood, to adulthood, and finally old age. And next to it are my neighbor's experiences through time. This outer border marks which experiences I anticipate having. I anticipate experiencing my future, but not my neighbor's. By accepting the extreme claim, this border is erased, revealing the separation you felt from your neighbor's future to be just an illusion. The only experience you can anticipate having is this one right now. When you no longer expect to experience the future, it makes your neighbor's future seem closer than before. From a certain perspective, you have the same amount of empathy for their future as you do for your own. So this is how it is possible to accept Watts's claim and the extreme claim. They are related, but they are also asking different questions. Watts asked, is the boundary of yourself as your body ultimately real? While the extreme claim asks, is the boundary of yourself through time ultimately real? You can accept that the self ultimately encompasses the entire universe, while also accepting that you don't anticipate experiencing your future more than your neighbor's future. All you can be sure of experiencing is this present moment. When I first started considering the extreme claim, it was pretty upsetting. You might think this idea would make you not care as much about the future, but it actually made me more empathetic to what the future holds for everyone. I realized that I was so worried about a future I wouldn't actually experience. If it was possible for me to have such a strong feeling towards my future, why couldn't I have the same depth of feeling for other people's futures too? There's no intrinsic reason to want my body's future to be better instead of someone else's. I'm not going to experience either. That's why I like visualizing the extreme claim as removing a false boundary and making everyone's future moments more connected than before. It is important to stress that the extreme claim isn't a reason to stop caring about your own future. You should still work to benefit yourself in the future. After all, you are in the best position to advocate for yourself. So you'll still have to act selfishly sometimes, but you'll act more empathetically to others after accepting the extreme claim. Gordon Cornwall characterizes the shift as one away from self-concern to sympathetic concern with all future beings. I think the two taboos actually complement each other. It might seem impossible to take Watts's advice and identify with the entirety of the universe if you are just one human in it. But the extreme claim shows how flexible your empathy can be. Who's to say our amount of empathy can't increase wildly past current amounts? Biology shows how empathy increases as animals evolve to be social. So there could be an environment that motivates humans to evolve to become even more empathetic. It's a nice daydream. I might discuss more of what that culture might look like in a future video. But for now, I will follow Watts's example by talking about practical applications of these ideas. What I like about Watts is his ability to speak plainly about such abstract and philosophical ideas. A perfect example of this is his chapter he simply titled, "So What?" After understanding, at least in theory, that the ego trick is a hoax and that beneath everything, I and universe are one, you ask, so what? What is the next step, the practical application? I will answer that the absolute vital thing is to consolidate your understanding. to become capable of enjoyment, of living in the present, and of the discipline which this involves. For unless one is able to fully live in the present, the future is a hoax. There's no point whatever in making plans for a future which you will never be able to enjoy. When your plans mature, you will still be living for some other future beyond. You will never be able to sit back with full contentment and say, "Now I've arrived." Your entire education has deprived you of this capacity because it was preparing you for the future instead of showing you how to be alive now. The future is a hoax, but that doesn't mean there's no point in making plans. Just like the reason people buy life insurance, the policyholder won't be the one benefiting from it. It is for the sake of other people in the future. In the same way, I will work hard today so future me can benefit from it. Even though Watts doesn't talk about the extreme claim, his advice is still very useful for people who accept the extreme claim. Don't try to get rid of the ego sensation. Take it, so long as it lasts, as a feature or play of the total process, like a cloud or wave, or like feeling warm or cold, or anything else that happens of itself. Getting rid of one's ego is the last resort of invincible egoism. It simply confirms and strengthens the reality of the feeling. But when this feeling of separateness is approached and accepted like any other sensation, it evaporates like the mirage that it is. For there is no fate unless there is someone or something to be fated. There is no trap without someone to be caught. You soon discover that you are able to go ahead with ordinary activities, to work and make decisions as ever, though somehow this is less of a drag. Your body is no longer a corpse which the ego has to animate and lug around. There is a feeling of the ground holding you up, and of the hills lifting you when you climb them. Air breathes itself in and out of your lungs, and instead of looking and listening, light and sound come to you on their own. I had a similar experience when I was able to accept the extreme claim. Just as contemplating the size of the universe is awe-inspiring and humbling, so is contemplating your relation to the rest of the conscious experiences in the universe. You could despair in your mortality, or take joy in being part of something so grand. If all this ends with the human race leaving no more trace of itself in the universe than a system of electronic patterns, why should that trouble us? For that is exactly what we are now. Flesh or plastic, intelligence or mechanism, nerve or wire, biology or physics, it all seems to come down to this fabulous electronic dance. Congrats on making it to the end of the video. Since you've made it this far, let me just recommend checking out some of my other videos. They are all directly about this topic, so hopefully they will answer some questions you are left with after this video. I'd especially recommend the video Consciousness is Anarchy, because it explains why our experiences seem to contradict the premise of the extreme claim. It describes experiments that illustrate the mental functions that keep the illusion going. Well, thanks for watching.